So LGBTQ is an initialism. It stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and questioning. So as an initialism, it's really good for talking about the the queer community as a whole. Queer is another sort of umbrella term used for the community, but it is limited in that it's only 5 letters. There are a whole lot of identities that do fit under the LGBTQ umbrella. Folks identify as pansexual, gender fluid, genderqueer, non-binary, or two-spirit are some of the more little bit well-known parts of the LGBTQ umbrella, but it's just an initialism used for all folks fit under that. Some folks also might hear SOGI, so sexual orientation and gender identity, or GSM, gender and sexual minority, used to refer to the community. Because there are just so many different types of folks under the umbrella, LGBTQ is a really good catch-all for talking about the community. So some of really easy pitfalls that we sometimes fall into in the school setting of not being the best support for an LGBTQ student is either not taking the step up to educate ourselves, or when we have that sort of space of not knowing, not taking the chance to protect an LGBTQ student if we're seeing something happening in the school. So it's things like getting up to date as much as reasonably possible on what being LGBTQ means, paying attention to the disparities that some folks see in educational outcomes between LGBTQ identified students and non-LGBTQ identified students. These are things like LGBTQ students missing school at higher rates than non-LGBTQ students, and that shows up in educational outcomes as well. It's also things like seeing negative health outcomes at a much higher rate for LGBTQ students as compared to non-LGBTQ students. These are things like having multiple bad mental health days in a sort of given time period. These are things like suicidal ideation or even suicide attempts. You really do see across the board with these types of negative mental health outcomes, LGBTQ students are facing them at a much higher rate than non-LGBT students. And outside of that education, one of the things that educators can do to sort of step up as well is to simply intervene if they are hearing somebody say something like, "Oh, that's so gay," or "You're just being a sissy," or "You're just being a Nancy." That's a old school one that we hear every once in a while. But when educators, even if they're not 100% sure on maybe the language that they should be using, but if they're stepping up and being in support for that student that is seeing that harassment, it really can contribute to a positive school culture. Other things that schools sort of sometimes fall into is not respecting the name or pronouns of a student. It's really, really easy, simple step that we can take to make sure that a student does feel affirmed in their school environment. One of the easy ways to do that too in a sort of school classroom setting is just at the beginning of the school year, when everybody's going around introducing themselves, have everybody just stand up, say their name, and say the pronouns that they use. When I'm introducing myself, I generally say, "Hi, my name is Jordan. My pronouns are he, him, his." So that means I use those pronouns when I'm interacting with folks. And when we use that as sort of a norm that everybody engages in, it makes it so it's not something that we're only doing for LGBTQ identified students. So it's not really putting the onus on the LGBTQ student to advocate for themselves, but really setting a culture wherein they're equal, the same as everybody else. And that also helps protect trans students in particular, because it means that sort of paying attention to gender and paying attention to these pronouns isn't something that only happens within the trans community, but is something that impacts all of us as well. So when a LGBTQ student feels unsafe in school, it means that one of the biggest things that we do see is that they're not going to show up to school. You see that there's a 4 times more likely sort of instance of LGBTQ students missing school as compared to non-LGBTQ students. And not only that, they have a higher prevalence of missing 4 or more days of school as compared to non-LGBTQ identified students. And that you do see that show up in things like grade point averages as well. The GPAs on average in the state of Colorado for non-LGBTQ students sits at about 3.4%. That GPA for LGBTQ identified students sits at about 2.4. And you can sort of see that correlation between missing more days of school and less of a GPA because you're just missing that crucial instruction time. So you do see a very large disparity between LGBTQ identified students and non-LGBTQ identified students in terms of suicide ideation and attempts as well. I want to say that one of the interesting things that we see coming out of this research as well is that being LGBTQ identified correlates with that higher instance of suicide ideation and attempts, but that sort of homophobia that they're experiencing at the school level also comes back and impacts straight students as well. One thing that we've noticed here in Colorado is that while being LGBTQ identified is a risk factor for attempting suicide or having suicidal ideation, when an LGBTQ student is bullied for their gender identity or sexual orientation, but when a non-LGBTQ student is bullied for their perceived gender identity or for their perceived sexual orientation, that risk factor is actually at a much higher rate than you see for an LGBTQ identified student. So you see that homophobia plays out as sort of a long-standing sort of haze that LGBTQ students have to try and live under, and that brings down their mental health sort of outcomes for that. But also when a non-LGBTQ identified student gets hit with that homophobia, they too become at risk for all these with all these mental health outcomes as well. GSAs, or gay straight alliances, also known as gender and sexuality alliances, are one of the easiest supports that a school can implement to try and create an inclusive school culture, not only for LGBTQ students, but for all students in that school. You really see that when a GSA is located in a school, students report hearing homophobic remarks at about 2 times less the rate than in schools that don't have GSAs. And not only that, but educators and school professionals do step up to intervene when they hear those homophobic remarks, when they hear those transphobic remarks, when they hear those biphobic remarks in school. They're 2 times more likely to do that in schools with GSAs as compared to schools that don't have GSAs. This isn't just to say that you can put a GSA in a school and everything's going to turn out fine, but the two correlate, because when you're really implementing that GSA and making sure that it does become part of the school culture, you're doing the work that it takes to make it safe for all students to be who they are, to be out, to be proud, and to be welcome and affirmed, no matter the setting. Simply showing up and saying, hey, there are LGBTQ students here, is one of those quick steps to make that happen. And not only that, more often than not, when you're starting a GSA, you need to identify a supportive teacher in that school environment as well. And having a supportive teacher, or having a teacher that students can point to as being affirming and supportive for their gender identity or sexual orientation, is one of the best interventions and one of the best protective factors that you can have in a school to decrease the rate of things like suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and bad mental health days. So for folks looking to start a GSA, the best way to get it started is to have it come from the youth themselves. One of the cool things about GSAs is that they are federally protected under the Equal Access Act. So if a school has any other sort of extracurricular club that is non-academic, that uses school space or anything like that, that school will also federally be required to allow a GSA to meet as well. Making sure that these GSAs are student run and student organized, make sure that you are interacting at that school culture level with the students to affect the change that you want to see too. So you really do having a student buy-in there, make sure that the GSA lasts not only for this year, but on into the future as well. And for folks that are looking to start GSAs or are just not maybe necessarily sure where to go for the best information, you can always reach out to One Colorado. We have many publications and resources for folks who are looking to start a GSA on the best ways to do that. Not only that, but the Gay Straight Alliance Network, as part of GLSEN, is the Gay Lesbian Straight Education Network, is another place for folks to go to get that information on how to implement a GSA in their schools. For folks looking for general sort of LGBTQ resources, how to support a student that's coming out or transitioning, how to support parents and families and guardians who might not be necessarily at the place where they're accepting, but they want to get there. For all these sorts of folks, there's a whole bunch of resources. PFLAG, Parents and Friends of PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, is one great resource, as well as the Human Rights Campaign, GLSEN, as I just said. Here in Colorado, we have TYES, T-Y-E-S, Trans Youth Education Supports, and Youth Scene. And a whole bunch of other states are going to have individual local organizations for folks to reach out to as well. So the easiest thing that we can do to make sure a campus is safe is to meet students where they're at and let the students take the lead. As somebody who's been doing this work, I really do see that the kids that I'm interacting with on the in that sort of GSA context are so far ahead of where my own understanding on gender, sexual orientation is. And they're the ones that are really going to be the ones who we have to meet. And even if we're not 100% on the terminology, or even if we're still learning about how we can be the best ally, simply stepping up when the time comes, or when we see homophobia, when we see transphobia, when we see biphobia, simply stepping up and intervening when those happen, even if we're not sure about the correct language to do it, really does show that the school and that culture that the school is creating is inclusive and is affirming. Even if we're not sure about, oh, I don't want to misgender somebody, I don't want to use the right pronouns, simply saying, hey, you called that thing gay, hey, you called that kid a faggot, hey, you called that kid a dyke. Simply stepping up and saying that that's wrong and not okay is the easiest step that we can take, and the first step that we can take to make sure that schools are safe. It's simply stepping up and saying, hey, we're open and welcoming here.